A single fold on the sleeve of a shirt. It was that simple, almost insignificant gesture that made Sarah's world crumble that first night. The 8-year-old boy, sitting at the dinner table in his new home, folded the fabric 3 times with methodical precision she knew all too well. Sarah felt the fork slip from her fingers, hitting the plate with a sharp clang that cut through the silence. David, her husband, looked up from his own plate, a crease of concern forming on his forehead. "Are you okay, honey?" But Sarah barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on Oliver, the boy who, after years of failed attempts and endless fertility clinic visits, had finally come into their lives to complete their family. Oliver, who was now adjusting his sleeve exactly the way Thomas used to. Thomas, her brother, who had disappeared 20 years ago, taking with him secrets the family had buried as deeply as an empty coffin. The resemblance was more than a coincidence. It was as if the past had resurfaced. Sitting at her table, eating homemade pasta with tomato sauce. "Sarah?" David's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another room, another life. She forced a smile, her hands trembling beneath the table. "I just remembered I forgot to call the school about the transfer documents." The lie slipped out easily, years of practice in concealing her emotional scars, making the act almost natural. Oliver lifted his dark eyes to her, eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Eyes that, she now saw with painful clarity, were identical to her brother's. How had she not noticed before? The same thick eyebrows, the same almond-shaped gaze, the same depth that seemed to hold too many stories for someone so young. The rest of dinner passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Sarah moved like an actress on a stage, serving dessert, smiling at the right moments, answering questions with words that barely registered. Her mind was miles away, rummaging through dusty family albums, unearthing memories she had sworn to keep locked away. Later, after putting Oliver to bed, a ritual that should have been purely joyful but was now stained with doubts and fears, Sarah found herself alone in her office. The laptop's glow illuminated her face in the dim room as her fingers typed frantically, searching for any information about the orphanage where they had found Oliver. The screen displayed bureaucratic data, cold dates, and partial information about a child abandoned 6 years ago at a rural hospital. But it was a small detail buried within paragraphs of social reports that made her heart stop. The name of the town. The same town where her brother had last been seen 2 decades ago. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, as if that could somehow block out the avalanche of possibilities threatening to bury the life she had so carefully built. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and she knew she would find no peace until she uncovered the truth, even if that truth threatened to destroy everything she and David had worked for. In the room next door, she could hear the soft breathing of Oliver, the son fate had brought to her. Or was it more than fate? Was it the past coming back to collect its debts, to expose secrets long buried? Sarah stayed awake all night, watching shadows dance on the ceiling as a certainty grew in her chest. Oliver was not just a child she had longed for. He was the key to a mystery her family had tried so hard to forget. And now, there was no turning back. Morning arrived with the peculiar cruelty of sleepless nights. Sarah watched Oliver in the yard, play with a toy car David had bought the day before. Each movement of the boy was like a page being turned in a book she thought had been closed forever. "He's adapting well," David commented, appearing at her side with 2 cups of coffee. His smile carried the pride and joy of a newly discovered father. "It's almost like he's always been here." Sarah felt the coffee burn down her throat. If only David knew how painfully true those words might be. But how could she explain? How could she tell her husband that the son they had so carefully chosen might actually be her nephew? That fate, with its cruel irony, had brought into their home the child of the brother her family had cast away? "I need to go into town today," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Take care of some things for the store." It was another lie for the growing collection. In truth, Sarah planned to visit her mother, Eleanor, who had been living in a nursing home for 5 years. Ever since Alzheimer's had begun stealing her memories, Eleanor drifted between moments of crystal clear lucidity and periods of total confusion. Maybe, Sarah thought, in one of those moments of clarity, her mother could provide the answers she so desperately needed. The nursing home smelled of disinfectant and forgotten memories. Sarah found Eleanor sitting by the window, an unfinished puzzle spread out on the table before her. Her fingers moved over the pieces with the same methodical precision Oliver had when folding his sleeves. "Mom!" Sarah called softly, sitting beside her. Eleanor turned, her pale blue eyes focusing on her daughter's face with a clarity that made Sarah's heart leap. It was one of the good days. "Sarah, darling, did you bring the pictures I promised Thomas?" The name hit Sarah like a punch. "Mom, Thomas? Thomas isn't with us anymore, remember?" Eleanor frowned, confused. "Don't be silly. He was here last week. Showed me pictures of his son. A beautiful boy. He has his father's eyes." Sarah felt the world tilt. "What son, Mom? What did Thomas tell you?" But Eleanor had already drifted away again, her eyes returning to the puzzle. "These pieces, I can't get the colors to match. Too much blue. It was always your father's favorite color." Sarah tried asking more questions, but it was useless. Her mother had submerged into her jumbled memories, leaving her with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. Thomas had been alive just a few years ago, and he had a child. On the way home, Sarah stopped at a cafe, needing to collect her thoughts before facing David and Oliver. Her phone vibrated. A message from David asking if she would bring dessert for dinner. The normalcy of the question almost made her cry. As she waited for her coffee, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out an old, yellowed photo. In it, Thomas smiled, a skinny teenager with eyes too deep for his age. The same eyes that now looked at her every morning from across the breakfast table. The waitress set down her coffee, and Sarah noticed her hands trembling as she lifted the cup. The truth was there, so close she could almost taste its bitterness. But revealing it would mean more than just confirming her suspicions about Oliver. It would mean unearthing 2 decades of family secrets, exposing the lies her father had built, and confronting the role they had all played in Thomas's disappearance. And David, how would he react to discovering that his wife had kept this possibility to herself since the very first night? That she had recognized in Oliver traces of a family history stained by shame and silence? Sarah closed her eyes, letting the weight of reality settle in. In just 2 days, the carefully constructed life she had built was unraveling. And the irony was, for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The shoebox was exactly where Sarah had left it 2 decades ago, hidden in the back of her old bedroom closet. Her parents had never bothered to clear out the space after she moved out, turning it into an unintentional museum of her youth. Now, as her fingers brushed over the thick layer of dust on the lid, she felt the weight of the memories she had locked away. David was away on a 3-day business trip, and Oliver was spending the afternoon at a new friend's house. The silence of the old family home pressed down on her as she sat on the bed, the box trembling in her lap. Inside, Thomas's letters were arranged by date, each one telling a fragment of the story her family had fought so hard to bury. The last letter, received just a week before his disappearance, was yellowed and fragile. Sarah unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words she knew by heart. "Dear Sarah, there are things I need to tell you. Truths I can no longer carry alone. Dad is not who everyone thinks he is." A noise downstairs made her freeze. Voices. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had told the housekeeper she would come the next day to pick up some old family albums. "Mr. Richards, are you sure you don't want to wait for your daughter?" The housekeeper's voice carried a note of concern. "In my own house? Don't be ridiculous, Margaret." Her father's voice, still strong despite the years, made Sarah's breath hitch. She began stuffing the letters back into the box, but a photograph slipped from one of the envelopes, sliding under the bed. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Sarah shoved the box back into the closet and crouched to reach for the lost photo, her fingers grasping it just as the door swung open. Sarah? The surprise in her father's voice quickly morphed into something darker. What are you doing here? She stood slowly, the photograph hidden behind her back. Dad, I just came to pick up some old albums. For Oliver. Oliver. Richard said the name as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. Your new son. He stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping over the space with an intensity Sarah knew all too well. Funny how some things have a way of coming back to haunt us, don't they? A chill ran through her. There was something in his voice, a veiled certainty, that suggested he knew more than he should. What are you talking about? Richard closed the door behind him, the click of the lock sounding like a sentence. You've always been clever, Sarah. But sometimes being too clever is dangerous. He moved to the window, looking out at the garden where she and Thomas used to play as children. Your brother was clever. Too clever for his own good. You, Sarah's throat tightened. You know about Oliver? A humorless smile crossed her father's face. I've always known. Just like I know Thomas didn't die in that accident like everyone thinks. He turned to face her, his eyes as hard as stone. He's alive, Sarah. Or at least he was 5 years ago. The photo slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, revealing itself. Richard picked it up before she could react. It was a recent picture, far more recent than any other she had of Thomas. In it, her brother held a baby in his arms. A baby with deep brown eyes and thick eyebrows. Where did you get this? Richard's voice was dangerously calm. It was in the letters. Sarah found her strength, straightening her shoulders. Why, Dad? Why lie all these years? Why make us believe he was dead? To protect this family. To protect you. Richard crushed the photograph in his fist. Some truths are like poison, Sarah. They destroy everything they touch. Like you destroyed Thomas's life. The words escaped before she could stop them, carrying 2 decades of repressed pain. The slap came fast and unexpected, the sound echoing in the silent room. Sarah stumbled, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. It wasn't the first time her father had hit her, but it was the first time in 20 years. You know nothing, Richard hissed. And if you're smart, you'll keep it that way. That boy, Oliver, he doesn't belong in this family. He never did. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. In her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, revealing a picture far darker than she had ever imagined. Her father hadn't just known about Oliver. He had orchestrated the entire adoption process, ensuring the boy ended up exactly where he could be controlled. The question was, why? Sarah drove home in a daze, the imprint of her father's fingers still burning on her cheek. The autumn afternoon cast golden shadows on the pavement, but she barely noticed the beauty around her. In her mind, fragments of memories and recent revelations blended together like pieces of a grim puzzle. When she arrived, she found Oliver sitting on the porch, a book in his lap, the same place where Thomas used to sit and read when they were kids. The boy looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and the smile he gave her was so genuine, so full of innocent trust, that Sarah felt her heart break. How was your friend's house? She asked, sitting beside him. Good. His mom made cookies. Oliver closed his book, his fingers tracing the cover absent-mindedly. But she doesn't make them like you. Yours are better. The simplicity of the comment, the purity of that moment, made Sarah's eyes burn with unshed tears. How could her father say this boy didn't belong to their family? Oliver was more than blood and documents. He was love in its purest, truest form. And Sarah? Oliver's voice was small, hesitant. The title caught her off guard. What did you say? Oliver lowered his eyes, his hands moving nervously over the book. I always knew. My dad showed me pictures of you before he left. The world stopped. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs in a painful rush. You knew your father? Thomas. Oliver nodded, silent tears beginning to spill down his cheeks. He left me at the hospital because he said he couldn't protect me. He said Grandpa was dangerous. that I'd be safer away from him. His voice trembled. He promised to come back, but he never did. Sarah pulled Oliver into her arms, feeling his small body tremble with suppressed sobs. "How long have you been carrying this secret?" she whispered, stroking his hair. "Dad said it was important to pretend I didn't know, that it was the only way you could adopt me." Oliver pulled back slightly, his dark eyes searching hers. "I didn't want to ruin everything." The confession hit Sarah like a wave. Her nephew had kept silent, carrying the weight of his own history, just for a chance to belong. The irony hurt. He had always belonged. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. David was home. Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. How could she explain this to her husband? How could she make him understand that the son they had adopted was part of a far greater web of secrets? Oliver must have sensed her tension, because he squeezed her hand tightly. Will he be mad? "I don't know, sweetheart." Sarah kissed the top of his head. "But I promise you, no matter what happens, you'll never lose us. Never again." The keys jingled in the front door. Sarah took a deep breath, preparing for the hardest conversation of her life. But now, there was something different. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Oliver was by her side. And some truths, no matter how painful, needed to come to light. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was as heavy as lead in the living room. David sat in the armchair, his face buried in his hands, while Oliver had retreated to his bedroom at Sarah's request. The truth, now finally exposed, hung between them like a physical presence. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" David's voice was low, laced with hurt. "From the very first night you suspected, and you said nothing." Sarah approached him, torn between the love for her husband and the need to protect Oliver. "I needed to be sure. And after that..." She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "After that, I was afraid of losing both of you." David finally lifted his face, his red-rimmed eyes meeting hers. "Losing us? Sarah, we built this family together. Every doctor's appointment, every failed attempt, every shattered hope. We faced all of it as a couple. And now you're telling me that our son is actually your nephew? That your father orchestrated all of this?" Sarah sat on the arm of his chair, her hands trembling. "There's more," she whispered. "I found this at my father's house today." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket, extending it toward David. Inside were a series of documents, bank records, money transfers, old emails. The truth they revealed was even darker than Sarah had imagined. Her father hadn't just manipulated Oliver's adoption. He had paid people to keep Thomas away, to create the story of his death. "He's alive, David. My brother is alive, and my father knows where he is." David scanned the documents, his expression shifting from shock to comprehension. "The monthly payments to a psychiatric clinic?" Sarah nodded, silent tears rolling down her face. "Thomas never abandoned Oliver by choice. My father had him committed, using his influence and money to keep him locked away. And then," her voice faltered, "and then he orchestrated everything so Oliver would end up with us, where he could still control the situation." "But why?" David stood up, pacing to window. What would be the purpose of all this? At that moment, a sound on the stairs caught their attention. Oliver stood at the bottom step, holding something in his hands, a small red notebook. "I know why," he said, his voice small but firm. "My dad gave me this before he disappeared. He said I should only show it when I found someone I could really trust." Sarah and David exchanged a look, and Oliver stepped forward, extending the notebook. Sarah opened it carefully, immediately recognizing her brother's handwriting. The first words made her blood run cold. "If you're reading this, it means I managed to get my son to safety. What I'm about to reveal may destroy our family, but silence has already caused too much destruction." The following pages contain the truth Richard had worked so hard to hide. Documents, photos, evidence of years of embezzlement, manipulation, and abuse of power. Thomas had discovered everything, and that knowledge had cost him his freedom. He tried to protect me, Oliver said softly, his hand finding Sarah's. Now it's our turn to protect him. David knelt before them, his eyes locking onto Oliver's. You are our son, he said firmly. Nothing will change that. But you're right, we need to help your dad. It's time to end the silence. Sarah embraced them both, feeling, for the first time in days, that she could finally breathe. The truth had brought pain, but it had also brought a chance for healing, for justice, for redemption. It was time to bring Thomas home. The psychiatric clinic loomed against the gray sky, its red brick walls holding stories of pain and isolation. Sarah held Oliver's hand tightly, while David spoke with the receptionist. After 2 weeks of careful preparation, gathering evidence, obtaining legal documents, they were finally here, just steps away from Thomas. Room 317, David whispered when he returned, his hand resting on Sarah's back in a silent gesture of support. They're finalizing the paperwork. Oliver adjusted the bow tie he had insisted on wearing. I want to look nice when I meet my dad for real, he had said that morning. Sarah felt her heart clench at the mix of pride and pain those words carried. The hallway felt endless. Each step took Sarah deeper into her memories. Summer afternoons with Thomas, whispered secrets, promises broken by time and fear. When they finally reached room 317, her legs trembled so much that David had to steady her. Ma'am, the head nurse approached, clipboard in hand. I need to warn you. The patient has spent a long time in isolation. He may not be the way you remember. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The nurse unlocked the door, and the sound of the key turning echoed to the years of separation. The room was simple, bathed in soft light from a barred window. And there, sitting in a chair by the window, was Thomas. Thinner than Sarah remembered, gray streaks at his temples, but still her brother. Still the boy who had once promised to always protect her. Thomas. Her voice came out as a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes, Oliver's eyes, meeting hers. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, something shifted in his expression. Sarah? His voice was hoarse from disuse. Is this real this time? It's real, Thomas. The tears ran freely down her face now. And I'm not alone. Oliver stepped forward, and the world seemed to freeze. Thomas stood up so abruptly that his chair nearly toppled over, his gaze fixed on the son he hadn't seen in 5 years. Oliver. The name came out like a prayer. My boy. Oliver ran, closing the distance between them in seconds, throwing himself into his father's arms. Thomas clung to him, deep sobs shaking his body as he buried his face in his son's hair. I'm sorry, he murmured between tears. I'm so sorry for leaving. I thought I was protecting you. I know, Dad. Oliver pulled back just enough to look into his father's eyes. I kept your journal. I kept everything. And now, he looked at Sarah and David. Now we have a whole family to protect us. Thomas lifted his eyes to his sister and brother-in-law, decades of pain and regret swimming in his gaze. Sarah, No. She stepped closer, taking his hand. There's nothing to forgive. Dad, he manipulated all of us. But it's over, Thomas. It's over. David joined them, completing the family circle. The documents you kept, the evidence we gathered, they won't just set you free, Thomas. He met his brother-in-law's gaze. They'll make sure Richard can never hurt any of us again. A sound at the door made them turn. The head nurse stood there, unshed tears in her eyes. The release papers are ready, she said softly. You can go home. Home. The word carried a new meaning now. It wasn't just a place. It was the people in it. This family, rebuilt from the ashes of silence and pain. Thomas rose, still holding Oliver close, as if afraid the boy might disappear. Home, he repeated, his voice growing stronger. Together, Sarah, David, Oliver, and Thomas walked out of the clinic into the bright afternoon light. And for the first time in 20 years, the weight of the past no longer held them captive. Some families are built by blood. Others, like theirs, are forged by choice, the choice to love, to forgive, to stay. And those, perhaps, are the strongest of all. 6 months had passed since that afternoon at the clinic. The garden of Sarah and David's home was blooming with the first colors of spring, a reflection of the renewal their family was experiencing. Thomas now lived in the guest house at the back of the property, close enough to be part of Oliver's daily life, but with the space he needed to rebuild his own. That Sunday morning, the family gathered for breakfast on the porch. Oliver, between bites of pancakes, excitedly told him about his school presentation a week before, a story about family that he had written himself. And when I finished reading, my teacher was crying. He said, pride shining in his eyes. She said she had never heard anything so beautiful about what it really means to be a family. Sarah watched the scene with her heart overflowing. David was preparing more coffee. Thomas was helping Oliver cut his pancakes. And they were all together in harmony that had once seemed impossible. Richard was in prison, awaiting trial for years of manipulation and abuse of power. In the end, the truth had found its way into the light. You know what I love most about this place? Thomas asked quietly, his eyes scanning the garden, the sound of birds in the morning. I had forgotten what it was like to wake up to that. Sarah reached across the table and took her brother's hand. The nightmares still came some nights, and there were days when the weight of the past felt heavier than others. But they were learning together that healing didn't have to be perfect to be real. Dad, Oliver called, wiping syrup from his face. Will you take me for a bike ride today? Uncle David taught me, but I want to show you how I've learned. Thomas's smile lit up his entire face. Of course, buddy. He turned to David, gratitude in his eyes. Thank you for being there for him when I couldn't be. David simply shook his head. We're a family. All of us. Sarah stood up to get more juice, pausing for a moment to take in the sight of her family through the kitchen window. Oliver's laughter mixed with the adults' conversation, creating a melody that mended old wounds. On the fridge, a new drawing by Oliver showed 5 figures holding hands. Himself, Thomas, Sarah, David, and even Eleanor, who was gradually recovering fragment of memory on her good days. The doorbell rang, breaking her thoughts. At the door, a social worker stood holding a folder. Mrs. Williams? I'm here to deliver the final documents for the legal guardianship arrangement. Sarah invited her in, calling the others. As they signed the papers, Thomas, Sarah, and David, each taking their official role in Oliver's life. Sarah noticed silent tears slipping down her brother's face. Are you okay? She asked softly. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. It's just that, for so long I was so afraid. Afraid that he would never know how much I loved him. Afraid that the truth would only cause him more pain. He looked at Oliver, who was playing with a toy car on the rug. But you proved that love is stronger than fear. That the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free. After the social worker left, the family returned to the porch. The morning sun bathed the garden in golden light, and Oliver ran to grab his bike, eager for his ride with his dad. Ready? Thomas asked, holding onto the handlebars as Oliver climbed onto the seat. Ready? The boy smiled, his eyes, the same eyes that first stirred Sarah's memories, shining with pure joy. Sarah and David watched as father and son rode off down the garden path, their shadows blending together in the morning light. The silence that remained wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was light with the promise of better days ahead. Some families are built on blood and tradition. Others, like theirs, are forged through choice, the choice to love, to forgive, to stay. And those, perhaps, are the strongest of all. Dear friends who have followed this journey with us, we hope this story has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours while telling it. If you connected with the moments of discovery, forgiveness, and unconditional love that our family experienced, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next emotional stories. Your presence and support inspire us to keep sharing these narratives that remind us of the transformative power of love and truth. See you in the next story.